I'm Daryl Lim. I serve as Associate Dean for Research and Strategic Partnerships, and I'm also the H. Laddie Montague Junior Chair in Law. Welcome to Profiles in Leadership. This series explores leadership through the eyes of judges, lawyers, scholars, and institution builders as they reflect on their journeys, professional commitments, and the lessons they have learned along the way. It's a privilege to welcome today's guest, Professor Michael Seng from the University of Illinois Chicago School of Law. He has devoted his career to civil rights, fair housing, comparative law, restorative justice, and legal education. From his early work with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund during the civil rights era, to litigating cases that reached the United States Supreme Court, to founding and leading the Fair Housing Legal Support Center, to advancing rule of law initiatives in the Czech Republic and beyond, his work reflects a lifelong commitment to human dignity and justice. It's an honor to welcome you to Profiles in Leadership.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start at the beginning. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in a very small town in Iowa by the name of Lost Nation. So it was a town of about 500 people and largely a farming community, typical Iowa town.
So then you decided to study history at Notre Dame. How did that come about?
Well, history was something I was always uh, interested in. And and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, but I wanted to do something that was useful. So history, to look back and see where we had been, seemed a good area of study. I think uh, again, growing up in Iowa, there was a strong sense of community, a strong sense of accomplishment, individualism, and all of that. So that all sparked me to proceed in my studies.
Well, what's your favorite period in history?
Uh, it, it was more, I like medieval history, modern history.
Well, we certainly are at least living in one of those times. I'm not sure which.
Right.
Also, then you decided that you also wanted to do law. Tell us about that journey.
Okay, well, I decided to do law primarily because I was thinking about journalism. I was thinking of about a number of other areas, and law really provided me the flexibility to do whatever I wanted to do when I really wasn't certain what I wanted to do. So I liked the idea of law. It was connected with history. It enabled, I thought, me to have a impact on people's lives, hopefully positively. So it was sort of a natural.
So during this period, of course, was the civil rights movement. And that was something that in many ways you had dedicated your lives to elevating, to supporting. But back then, it was something that was just happening around you. But I think what people don't realize is that it didn't just appear out of somewhere, the idea that people had to be treated with dignity and respect. But what do you think was special about that time that gave rise to the movement?
Uh, I think there was a lot of idealism. Um, I grew up again in Iowa in the 40s and 50s, and we had just completed the Second World War where we were fighting Nazism and that type of thing. I remember actually I was in junior high when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. There really wasn't a lot of diversity or anything in Iowa at that time, but it was something that really interested me. I remember as a bit younger reading about Marian Anderson and her attempt to sing at the Daughters of American Revolution and ending up at the Lincoln Memorial, and that kind of inspired me. And then with the election of John Kennedy and the uh, Martin Luther King. I remember he spoke at Notre Dame when I was an undergraduate. Uh, uh, when I was at Notre Dame, Vatican II was going on. So there was a lot of idealism, a lot of feeling that we could make the world better. And so I think civil rights was right in the middle of it.
What else do you remember about your time at law school?
Well, oh, I remember law school was not a lot of fun. It was, I think, after my first class when I got called on and stumbled all over the place. I remember calling home and saying, I don't think law is for me. I'm going to quit law school. My parents told me to keep on, which was a good thing. But again, uh, during my second year of law school, we had a new professor come who had spent the previous summer in Mississippi doing civil rights. And he talked to some of us and um, encouraged me to volunteer to go to Mississippi the summer between my second and third year. And that was really changing, life changing, because it exposed me to new ideas, to situations I had never really experienced before. And it's something I really never got over.
Well, that was my next question for you, so it's perfect segue. What did you experience that summer in Mississippi?
Well, again, it was 1966. I volunteered and worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Jackson. They assigned me to go to Clarksdale, Mississippi, which was uh, then the home of Aaron Henry, who was the president of the NAACP in Mississippi. And just contemporaneously with me arriving in Mississippi, James Meredith, who had been the first Black man to attend the University of Mississippi, started a march from the northern border. He was going to march all the way to Jackson. He got shot. So that focused attention on Mississippi. This was 3 years after the murder of the three civil rights workers. So it was a very, very tense time. I remember one of my first assignments was to go to Drew, Mississippi. I met Fannie Lou Hamer, and several of us law students went around interviewing people who had tried to integrate the schools, had faced violence, and uh, uh, great difficulties. So we interviewed those people. I spent the most of the summer in Clarksdale, where I again investigated the segregated schools there in connection with a suit that was already pending to integrate the schools, and this was about 12 years after the Brown decision, and worked on a lot of welfare rights issues, which really opened my mind to the poverty and the terrible conditions that people were living under that I had really never been exposed to before. So it was really very life-changing. And I saw how law could be used as a vehicle to help people to reform society. And it really made me a convert.
Well, when you were there, did you feel any hostility, aggression for the work that you were doing?
Uh, I was never personally threatened. When we would go out on the plantations and interview tenant workers and things like that, you always felt uncomfortable. I always felt more uncomfortable for the people I was working with. I knew that they probably faced challenges that I would not be exposed to, and economic as well as threats to their lives and safety. It what it made me realize, and I remember we were told that if anything happened, we were to immediately uh, given a phone number to call and that type of thing. but this was in the period of J. Edgar Hoover and all of that. It made me realize how vulnerable people were when you didn't have legal support. The state of Mississippi obviously was not going to protect people. The federal government at that stage, even though we were in the midst of the civil rights struggle, was not particularly sensitive to the needs of civil rights workers and Black workers, and the FBI was uncertain whose side they were on in those days. So it was a very I would say mind-opening experience, and it did make me realize the importance of law and the what happens when the rule of law is disregarded.
Thanks. We talk a lot about the rule of law. Of course, civil rights is an idea that is now foundational to how we think about the rule of law. Social justice is a term that seems to have risen in popularity and prominence in more recent times. Talk to us about how the three ideas relate to each other.
Well, I think they're all interrelated. Civil rights is really related to fairness and justice. Human rights is a more modern term that we speak about that has more of an international flavor. I mentioned the welfare rights movement, which again is um, not a movement anymore, but I think the whole question of food, shelter, clothing, all of those things are really important to people, no matter what they're doing. And the law plays a big role in how those things are distributed and everything. Uh, One thing that disturbs me today is I think in 1960s America, when I got my start in law, I think we were a much more unified country, even though you had the divisions in the South and the North and in civil rights. And I don't think there were the severe extreme economic conditions that we're seeing today, even though you had again in the South, and maybe that prefigured a lot of what we're experiencing today. Many people who were certainly below the poverty line, and then other people who were doing just fine.
Thanks. Now, you've spoken in the past about your influence, the influence of your Catholic upbringing and Notre Dame's emphasis on social justice on your work. Talk to us also about how religion plays a role in shaping these discussions.
I think it does. And when I refer to religion, I don't necessarily, and sometimes I'm uncomfortable talking about religion. I think there's an individualistic type of religion that can be destructive, but I think the whole idea of religion that we're all part of a broader community related to mankind's past as well as mankind's future, and the whole environmental movement, I think, is tied up with religion. When I was at Notre Dame, the president was Theodore Hesburgh, who was then on the uh, U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And I think he was very instrumental in showing that relationship between a religious belief and human dignity and human rights, which I think is so essential.
So you graduate and then you decide that you want to do some time as a law clerk. So you clerk for a federal judge. I'm going to ask you about that in a moment. And then you practice at Jenner and Block. And then you move to Cairo, not Cairo, Egypt, but Cairo, Illinois. So
That's
talk
right.
to us about each of those three stages of your career after law school.
Well, being a law clerk is something I really recommend to all my students. It's a nice transition between law school and practice. I had the advantage, I clerked for a federal district judge in Oregon, and that was lovely. I had not been on the West Coast before, and Oregon is a beautiful place. So I enjoyed the countryside, both the ocean and the mountains in Oregon. But the judge had me sit on trials, which was, I think, a wonderful experience. I got uh, the experience of talking to him about how trials were conducted and the lawyering that was being done in cases. And it was in many ways, I think, a very good transition between the academic world and the world of practice. And it was also just kind of after law school, kind of a relaxing year also. You weren't yet in the heat of law firm practice and that type of thing. And you were out of the worrying about exams. So it was kind of a nice year.
So, Jenna and Block.
Jenner and Block, that was a great experience. It was a big law firm here in Chicago. I never thought I'd want to work with a big law firm, but I did. I was relatively lucky when I was there. The day I was admitted to the bar, the firm came to me and said, "We like our attorneys to do some pro bono work. We've got a appeal in the Illinois appellate court, the criminal appeal. Would you be willing to take it?" I said, sure. I didn't know any better. And it seemed like a good case. It involved a couple of men who had been arrested and put in a lineup and identified. So I made the argument that number one, that they had been violated the Fourth Amendment by an illegal arrest, which I got one of the men off. The other one, they found that there was probable cause, and I argued that he was denied the right to an attorney. This was shortly after Roe versus Wade, or not Roe versus Wade, after the court had held the right to an attorney to post uh, indictment lineups. So this was a pre-indictment lineup, but I thought there was no real difference. I lost in the appellate court, took it to the Illinois Supreme Court. They didn't want to hear it. So I applied for cert to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they granted cert. So my first case ended up in the United States Supreme Court. And so that was a good experience. But at Jenner and Block, got exposed to a wide variety of things, everything from antitrust. This was the period of the Democratic Convention in Chicago, so I was able to represent some people in disorderly conduct cases and those types of things. So it was a very good experience for me. Jenner Block was known for its pro bono work, its public interest work, and so that appealed to me. So it gave me a very good foundation and opportunity to work with some lawyers who I thought had a very good sense of professional responsibility, but also engaged in a very, very a vigorous litigation practice.
Well, sounds like you did a lot there and it was a supportive environment. Were they surprised when you decided to leave?
Um, I'm not sure. I liked the big firm practice, but I decided it really wasn't for me. And that experience in Mississippi never really left me. And I was given several teaching offers while I was there, and I didn't feel I was ready for teaching. I didn't know whether I really wanted to teach. I wanted more experience as a lawyer. And then I saw an ad somewhere in Chicago in the legal journals or something about an opening that the head of the legal services office in Cairo, Illinois, was leaving, and they were looking for a replacement. And at that time, Cairo was just exactly like Mississippi. There were shootings down there, civil rights demonstrations. It was totally segregated, even though in a northern so-called free state, it really more resembled Mississippi certainly than at least the northern part of Illinois. So I went down there for 2 years. We had lawsuits, I think, against every city and county official that I can think of. We were successful in every lawsuit, settled most of the lawsuits that we had, except um, uh, two cases that ended up in the United States Supreme Court. And those were cases against the local judges and prosecutor. We ended up losing those cases in the United States Supreme Court on standing grounds and ripeness grounds. So more on technical issues, not on substance.
And then at what point did you decide that it was time to move on to the next stage of your career?
Well, I was down there 4 years, and all my predecessors, none of it had been down there more than 1 year. So I figured I more than um fulfilled my duty down there. I'd been 4 years at Jenner and Block, so I decided, well, every 4 years, maybe I should make a change. And
Except for your next vocation, which
which
lasted much more than 4 years.
I did not expect to spend a lifetime teaching law in Chicago, but I did. But actually, one of the public defender down in Cairo got in trouble and was called before the Attorney Discipline Committee. And one of the professors from the John Marshall Law School in Chicago came down to represent him. And he was a real firebrand. And I thought, my gosh, if there's a law school in the country that will employ somebody like that, I'm going to go to that law school. So I applied. They interviewed me. I would definitely not be hired in a law school today based on my interview because I remember saying to them, I really don't want to be a law school to sit around and publish articles. What I really want to do is be a law professor who's kind of an activist. I think teaching law will give me time to do a number of pro bono and civil rights work, and I'd like to continue in that area. So that's why I'd like to be a law professor. I don't think that would get me hired today, but it did at John Marshall in those days.
And that's certainly what makes John Marshall stand out because many of the people there, are people like you who are there to make a difference in the real world, not just as important as it might be in its own right. Scholarship is important, but there's a huge and I think underappreciated part in making real world differences through the kind of work that you and others at John Marshall had been doing and attracting people from all over the country because of the reputation that you had built in specific areas.
Yeah, and at that time we were an independent law school, so we could sort of chart our own course in terms of law school rankings and everything. We were never highly rated or anything, but I think we provided a good, solid education for students who really wanted to go out and were kind of scrappy and wanted to be a good lawyer. So I'm very proud of that. We, of course, a few years ago joined the University of Illinois at Chicago and we're now part of a larger institution, but I'd like to think that that kind of idealism and everything remains. Law schools have changed a lot. Again, there's a lot of more emphasis on scholarship and all of that, which is not bad. I've written my share of law review articles and things like that, both as a law student and as a professor. But I still think having lawyers being involved in real cases and taking part in the legal community is really important.
You remember your early years as a law professor?
Oh, yes, I was scared to death.
Did you make any of your students call their parents to say, I'm not going to go to law school anymore? I got so
I
taught.
hope not. I hope not. I always think of myself as sort of a softie, but then students come to me petrified. So there is that gulf between professor and student that you can't erase.
How have you seen students change over the years?
Oh, again, I started teaching right after Watergate. So students were very affected by Watergate and the Nixon era, and the role that lawyers played in the Watergate scandal and things like that. So that was on everybody's mind in those days. And of course, we still had uh, important issues of civil rights. Um, I think in some ways I'm seeing a real activism and social concern among students today that I think had been missing for maybe a couple decades. It may well be the activism that is going on, regarding immigration, diversity, equity, all of those types of issues. But I think there's a real concern about students as to where our country is going and whether they're liberal or conservative or anything. I think there's a seriousness among law students that was present when I first started teaching, maybe less so for a few years, but I think has always been there among law students. People go to law school, I think, because uh, most of them, I think, for very idealistic reasons.
Well, I want to talk now about something that you really have put your signature on, and that's fair housing. Uh, and this is something that the school, even today, and maybe especially today, is known for. How did that come about?
Well, I would say that the beginnings of that began when I was down in Cairo, Illinois. That The public housing down there was absolutely segregated. They had two projects, one for African Americans, one for white persons, and two waiting lists, absolutely segregated. We had a lawsuit on that that we litigated. At the very last stages, the Justice Department came into the lawsuit and helped settle it. Private housing was not so segregated, so that really opened my eyes to the problem of housing. When I was at General Block, I was not directly involved, but we did the contract buyers case, which was a major case in Chicago in those days, involving black persons who had to buy their homes on contract because their communities were redlined and they could not get conventional loans from banks. That litigation was eventually lost for the plaintiffs, but it had a big impact. But I think all of those things made me realize how fundamental housing was. You couldn't talk about education, you couldn't talk about jobs, you couldn't talk about voting rights or anything without uh, 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 talking about housing. And the same thing with social rights and welfare rights and all of that type of thing. If you don't have a place to live and you can't live where you want to live, that really affects all other rights. So when I came back to Chicago, I volunteered with the Metropolitan Open Housing Project here in Chicago, which actually had been started as a result of Martin Luther King's stay in Chicago in the summer of 1966, where he tried to establish a more open housing in Chicago. Dismally failed at that. But in 1968, when his assassination occurred, and when I moved to Chicago to join General Block, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act. So the Fair Housing Act was new. So I was doing a lot of volunteer work with the Leadership Council. Their lead counsel, Bill Caruso, came to me and said, why don't we involve the law students? John Marshall didn't have a clinic as such, but in kind of an externship program. So we did that for several years where students came over to the Leadership Council, helped litigate fair housing cases. And then it was decided in the 1988 amendments to the Fair Housing Act had been passed, which provided federal money for housing groups. So together with the Leadership Council and John Marshall, we got money, established the clinic at John Marshall, where the law students could directly do fair housing cases. We also established the center, which does fair housing training, and we both of these projects are still in existence. We I'm a firm believer that litigation is important, but public education on the law is even more important. So we educated landlords, housing providers, developers, fair housing organizations, civil rights leaders, lawyers, and particularly we trained everybody employed by HUD, many of the state and local human rights agencies through the years on fair housing law. So that's one thing that I am especially really proud of is every year we have a National Fair Housing Conference where we get leaders in the area to talk. I think it's an area where people come and get together. It's kind of a therapeutic in some ways for people working in the fair housing area. And I think it's an important thing. You hear a lot about voting rights. You hear a lot about other aspects of police brutality and all of that. But again, as I said, if you don't have housing and you don't have choice in housing and where you're going to live, and going way back to Supreme Court's decision in Jones versus Alfred H. Meyer in 1968, that if you're herding people into ghettos where they really have no sense of power, it's a recipe for disaster.
How many law schools around the country are you aware of that have fair housing clinics?
There's a few. There's a very good one at the University of Buffalo. There's several others, but many more clinics don't specialize in fair housing as such as doing more housing law in the sense of landlord, tenant, that type of thing, which is also very important.
Do you see that as a need for law schools to really think about investing in this?
Absolutely. Again, as I said, housing discrimination is really important. Housing law is, built on other civil rights law. It's very similar to employment discrimination under Title VII. Basically, the same principles that you use under the Voting Rights Act, disparate treatment, disparate impact, all of that type of thing. But I do think particularly in terms of students, I think the students really get an opportunity to see how the law impacts on social justice, economic rights, all that type of thing by examining fair housing law.
I'm going to ask you about your work in the Czech Republic in just a moment, but before we wrap up the fair housing conversation, help our viewers understand how is it that America, being in a first world country, with all the enormous prosperity, wealth, and concern about rule of law, it still faces what on Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a fundamental gap between where people should be and where people are.
Well, we have a wonderful Constitution, but it's 200 years old, and even the 14th Amendment and all of that is really now, practically 150 years old. I think we have not as a nation, and it maybe go back to the early mid 20th century of our fear of socialism, our fear of communism, and things like that, our kind of view of rugged individualism and all of that, you know, our federal system, all of that, I think, has led to our not prioritizing things like housing, food, education, all of that is so important to people. You know, I think there's been a feeling that those are more socialistic concerns that should be left to a private enterprise, and you know, the government's got to be involved in them as well. I, I'm not a communist or socialist by any means, but I do think that government-private partnerships, and you can't do this without the government, especially when you've got a class of people who have been excluded and who don't have the financial resources to do these things on their own.
And then here comes your next chapter and your work in the Czech Republic. How did that start?
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up in Iowa. There's a big Czech community in Iowa. My mother was of Czech ancestry, although several generations back, but she still spoke Czech. So I always grew up, you know, with that, at least half of me with that Czech heritage. But as I was growing up, Central Eastern Europe was all communist. There was no chance. I didn't even want to visit that area. And then starting in 1968, particularly, when just as I was starting the practice of law, the same year as the passage of the Fair Housing Act, you had the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, and putting down the kind of thawing of communism that was going on in that area of the world. And I remember watching that on television, and it was just right at the same time as the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where there was a lot of rioting on the streets and all that at that time. So I became very, very interested in what was happening in Eastern and Central Europe. And then when the Velvet Revolution came in 1989, 1990, I became really very interested. And at that time, the ABA was doing rule of law projects in the former communist countries. And we had one going in Lithuania. And as a result of that, a professor from at that time, it was still Czechoslovakia, was visiting the United States, and somebody from the ABA called me and said, "Would you be interested in hosting a professor from Masaryk University in the Czech Republic or in Czechoslovakia?" And I said, "Yes, definitely." And he came over, and we found out we had a lot in common. So he spent a week, and he said, "Would you mind if I brought about 10 members of my faculty over to meet your faculty and kind of talk about our curriculum?" So the next summer, he sent 10 faculty over, and we put on a program for them and everything. And then they invited us over there. They said, "We'd like to do a similar program for you." So I assembled a group of lawyers and judges and a few professors. We went over there. I thought this would be a one-time trip, and it resulted in study trips that we do every fall. Since then, a sister school relationship, the exchange of students. So each year we have at least one or two Czech students visit at the law school, and that has had a profound effect. We've had close to 50 students now on that program. Many of them are important judges, attorneys, public officials in the Czech Republic. That was all really centered on the rule of law. And it's interesting now that in many ways, as I look at court decisions in what is now the Czech Republic or Czechia, as it's more recently called, and what the government is doing and things like that. They're coming up with projects and court decisions and things like that that I think could be models for our courts to learn from.
Thanks. I was going to ask you about the value on comparative law. And sometimes there are two aspects to it. Of course, you learn about what other people are doing, but as a result of learning what other people are doing, it gives you a chance to reflect on your own legal system. And you are right in the middle of this comparative law enterprise. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And again, we have a program where American law students can study at Masaryk University for a semester. Their students come over here. I think that's, again, sort of like my experience as a law student in Mississippi, life-changing, because you start to look at things from a new lens. I recently have been doing a 3-week summer program where I take students over and they American students to study law for 3 weeks in the summer. And I think that's really important. I think you appreciate the good things in your legal system. You appreciate the difference, but you also realize that there are other ways of doing things. And not that you would necessarily adopt, what is being done in other legal systems. But I think it enables you to kind of look at your own system more objectively and judge, what is fair, what is justice, and things that we sort of take for granted. All of a sudden, you start questioning, is this really necessary? How fundamental is this? And other things that you sort of took for granted, you realize how important they are and how they really do need to be stressed.
And again, how many other law schools do you know that have this kind of relationship with the Czech Republic?
Uh, there's a few, and the Czechs are very open. They have a number of professors from the United States go over to teach for a semester. They also have 2 or 3 week courses, which I normally do during our spring break and everything. I'll go over for a week or two and teach a course on freedom of speech or something, which always is shocking because the European conception of freedom of speech is quite different from the American conception. So I think it's
Talk,
important.
talk
We're now,
about a little bit about that. How are they different?
well, in terms of, particularly in terms of hate speech, the Nazi experience, the Hitler experience had a profound effect on Europe, the idea of genocide and things like that. So again, where we talk about the marketplace of ideas and open and robust speech, they're more circumscribed as to what should be allowed, what should not be allowed. And I think in some ways that does produce reflection. I'm a supporter of the American view that once the government starts saying what is acceptable and what is not, you run into trouble. On the other hand, we can see the problems of when false speech is given prominence, and I think our system really depends upon a free and vigorous press. And if we don't have that, and economics and other things affect that, then will our system really work in the long run?
So in 2018 and again in 2024, you were honored by Masaryk University and the Czech government for your contributions. What did that recognition mean to you personally and professionally?
Well, it really meant a lot to me personally, mainly because, well, everybody likes to be recognized. And I think it uh, it made me realize that these 30 years of working um, with the universities and law students and professors over there uh, has had an impact. And I think that really is important. So the recognition was great. In some ways, I think, you know, professionally, I'm not sure what the effect of all of that is. I keep on doing what I'm doing. I personally had hoped the law school here would make more of it from a university standpoint to uh, get more involved. But it's it's always difficult to make people really believe that the United States is not the center of the universe, in that there really is a need to get beyond our borders and look at things and influence, have an influence beyond just our immediate concerns.
Very much so. Now, we talked about civil rights, we've talked about social justice. The other concept that you have been intimately tied to is restorative justice. How is that similar or different from these other concepts that we have talked about?
Um, Restorative justice, I mean, most of my career was really, in one way or another, involved in litigating disputes. So taught courses like federal jurisdiction, even in constitutional law and stuff. I generally taught from a litigation viewpoint as to, how these issues were resolved and things like that. Um, Restorative justice looks at things of, uh, you know, who has caused the harm? Why did they do that? Who has been harmed? How can we make amends? And how has this affected the community? How has the community um, created a situation where these types of harms occur? And how can that be corrected? So it takes a very holistic approach to things of looking at kind of the perpetrators of harm, the victims of harm, and the community at large, and trying to come up with a solution that will work for the future. Not so much as laying blame on anybody, but trying to work things out. The great thing I think about restorative justice is it's there's a number of ways to practice it, but it's often practiced in circles where everybody sits around, you have a talking piece, and everybody shares ideas. And I think the important thing about restorative justice and what I've learned from restorative justice is to listen. I think we as lawyers get the facts. We know what the legal solution is. We impose that solution, and we expect that to make things better. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You look at the 50 years of Brown versus Board of Education, and I'm talking about the first 50 years because Brown really doesn't play much of a role today, other than commemorations and things like that, where we were litigating those segregation issues and things like that. The courts imposing remedies generally on a very reluctant a defendant, and it all ends up that you can debate whether the schools are much better today than they were in the 1950s. But in any event, um, restorative justice requires everybody to listen. That you listen to everybody's side, and then you come together and mutually reach a solution that will work for everybody. And I think that's really important. I think one of the things that I try to impress with my law students is to listen to clients, listen to people in the community, go out into the community, get a context for things, and just don't think of litigating or solving narrow legal issues. That obviously is important, and there's a role for that. And I'm not discounting the importance of litigation where you can't work things out and where people really need to be sued. And the same thing with criminal law. And restorative justice works both in criminal law and civil law. But restorative justice does require us to sit down, listen to the person who's caused the harm, listen to the person who's been victimized, listen to members of the community who are affected by all of this, and to reach a broader consensus as to how we deal with not only crime, but family relations, economic problems, all of those types of things.
And talk about your work in this area.
Well, I teach a class. I don't teach it. It's a very collaborative class with the students, so the students participate. And each week we generally have somebody come in, sometimes lawyers, public defenders, prosecutors, people working in all aspects of the law. We have psychiatrists come in, social workers. We have formerly incarcerated persons, endless people who come in, and we talk in the class about problems and that type of thing. And then we start out in the public schools in Chicago, doing dealing with some of the violence in some of the communities. We found the schools were difficult to work with, to say the least. And so we're now working with the Union League Boys and Girls Club. We've involved the UIC medical school, their psychiatry school, and trauma-informed care. And we're dealing with students right now. We're in Pilsen, Humboldt Park, which are largely Spanish-speaking communities. They're very affected by the current crackdown on immigration. These kids are scared, they're troubled, and so the law students are listening to them, working with them, and showing them alternative forms of dispute resolution. And that's really what restorative justice is. It's in many ways, it's like mediation and all of that type of thing, but from kind of a broader standpoint.
So what advice would you give to students who want to do the kind of work that you've done throughout your career, whether it's civil rights, whether it's public service, whether it's comparative international rule of law type work?
Well, I think I still, when I went into law, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I thought, well, law is probably the most flexible profession you can go into. And I found that to be true. And I think if you go into law and are flexible, and if you're get bored or do something, don't be afraid to try something else. About every 20 years or so, I enter a new field, and it's scary. And especially as I get older, I guess my mind probably doesn't work as well, and I'm not as flexible. But I think law allows you that flexibility to do things, and I think it allows you to have an impact. Some of the things that you do, you think they're really going to have an impact, and ends up they kind of fizzle out. Other things you do, and I found that with my students that sometimes just the most innocent things that I've said over the years or something, the student will come back to me 20, 30 years later and said, that really had an impact. I remember that, something I won't even remember. But you never know when you're having an impact. And I'd also say do whatever you find is fun. If you get, you know, life is too short. You want to have a good time. You want to enjoy yourself, and I think that's equally important. So keep all of that in mind. Lead a very balanced life. Enjoy, and I know you're interested, Daryl, in music and all of that type of thing. So get out of law periodically and uh, refresh your mind. And uh, but I recommend law to every people who argue, and they've been arguing since I started practicing. Oh, the profession's overcrowded. There's no room to go any further. As long as there are human beings, there's going to be a need for lawyers.
All good advice. When you look at the world today and you see Ukraine and you look at the United States and you see Minnesota, Minneapolis, and even more close to home in Chicago, what gives you hope?
Um, Well, with me, it's working with young people because I find that young people still are idealistic, still feel that they can make a change, and I think have really often very good ideas. And I think that's important when I look at some of our courts, our government, and all of that. And I'm part of the beyond retirement generation that's still going. We need young people. We need new blood. We need new ideas, and I think that's all very helpful. So I'm very hopeful. Martin Luther King talked about a justice, and it's really an ideal. And you see pullbacks. You see things that are really discouraging, but I can't help but believe that in the long run, we keep pushing forward. At least I hope so. That's what, we just lost Jesse Jackson here in Chicago this week, and his motto was "Keep hope alive," and I think there's something to be said about that.
Very much so. Well, as we bring this conversation to a close, I want to give you a chance to just share some closing thoughts with our viewers.
Oh gosh, we've uh, uh, covered a lot. I think my closing thoughts is again, don't lose hope. Keep pushing, and it's a battle. If you're a lawyer, learn restorative justice, but also learn how to litigate. And when you have to, you carry the big stick. But on the other hand, I think more is accomplished when you sit down, listen, get a better understanding of where people are coming from, and try to work things out. And it's hard not to get discouraged sometimes. But uh, I think if you reach the right balance between um, your work, your family, uh, uh, enjoyment, play, all of that type of thing, uh, people can do well.
Well, thank you for this very thoughtful, very generous conversation. I think our viewers will see very clearly how the law is not just a system of rules, it's also a vehicle for dignity, equality, equity, and institutional reform. And we are so deeply grateful for your example, your service, and your lifelong commitment to justice. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Profiles in Leadership.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.